Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at Tale, the role-playing game. Tale is an RPG written by Han Olav Ekordrod, apologies if I've got your name wrong, and it has recently completed a successful Kickstarter. It bills itself as an easy-to-learn fantasy RPG that focuses on compelling storytelling and epic quests. In this review, I'm going to be looking at the core book. Now, Hans was kind enough to send me a review copy in PDF of his book. The PDF copy is 280 pages long and is black and white. Now, if you're new to my reviews, I do like a little capsule summary at the start for people who don't have time to watch the full extended video, and rate the book based on 4 categories, giving each a plus, a blank, or a minus. These are then added up to get the final rating, which I use the Fate ladder for. The categories are writing, the look of the book, the system, and the background. So, let's crack on with our capsule rating. So, for the writing of the book, I'm going to give it a blank. The writing style is interesting, albeit a little inconsistent, sometimes waxing poetical about the nature of magical elements, whilst at other times being extremely brief and to the point. Personally, I'd rather the book stuck with the brief style and reserve the poetry for brief flavour text or chapter beginnings. For the look of the book, I'm also going to give it a blank. Now, I should make it clear that the copy I'm reading is a minimal art, black and white, sort of work in progress PDF. So I really can't speculate too much on what the finished book will look like. Therefore, I felt no choice other than to give it a blank in this category. For the system, I'm also going to give it a blank. The system is an interesting one and it does have some good points. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it doesn't seem to have fully made up its mind whether it wants to be a slick, minimalist narrative game or a chunkier, slightly more traditional RPG. I think if it embraced either of these two extremes, it could be a good game. But trying to serve as a bridge between the two, you end up with a game that feels a little unfocused and schizophrenic. And finally, for the background, I'm also going to give it a blank. The world background is absolutely fine, there's nothing particularly wrong with it. However, it's nothing new or revolutionary, and certainly doesn't live up to the tales of being different from all other RPGs. So, if we look at the final rating, you can see that unfortunately I've given it a rating of mediocre. Now, don't get me wrong, Tale is a system with promise, and keep in mind that I'm reading an incomplete version, so it's possible more changes could be made. I think the system would benefit from being streamlined a little bit more, so as to do away with the pages upon pages of examples and modifiers that seem to become ever present in the later stages of the book. To use an analogy, I would say Tale is the RPG equivalent of a teenager. It doesn't really know what it wants to be yet and is trying a few different things on for size. Some of these work and some of them don't. However, if the game can choose a direction for itself and really embrace that direction, it could be a really, really interesting game. Okay, so that done, let's crack on with the detailed review. We start off with the introduction. It begins with a very brief blurb summarising the nature of an RPG and the roles of a GM and player. This section is brief and seems to presume familiarity with RPGs in general. I don't think that this is much of a stretch really, since if you're backing an RPG on Kickstarter, it's a safe bet that you've got at least a little bit of familiarity with RPGs in general. We are then provided with a list of rules or guidelines referred to in the book as key philosophies, which lay out some general guides on playing and enjoying Tale. For example, immersion. Describe your character's actions and speak in its voice. The GM will decide when it is time for you to consider the mechanics of your actions. Engage in the content created for you. I don't agree 100% with all of these keys. For example, when talking about immersion, which always seems to be a bit of a loaded term in RPG debates, I sometimes think it is useful to pull back from the game a little and discuss things in a less emotive and slightly more mechanical terms. Nonetheless, I think the inclusion of key philosophies is a good thing overall, because it gives you some idea of how the authors have written the work and how they believe it should be played. Whether or not you adhere to them 100% is obviously down to yourselves and your group, but it's interesting to see what the authors think. Next, we have the how to play section, which gives a more detailed description of, oddly enough, how to play the game, giving guidance on those new to RPGs on how they work. The section also promises, for those with more RPG experience, that Tale differs from other games. I have to admit to being a little sceptical about this, since I've seen the claim on a variety of different games, and I can only think of a handful that have really done anything truly different. Some similarities between players in RPGs and actors are drawn. Not anything really new, but it's cool to see some straightforward examples laid out for the reader. Some of these may seem a bit obvious to old hands. For example, state your character's actions, but stay patient. Take one step at a time to allow others to react. I think it's occasionally good to be reminded of these basics, in particular things like being patient, allowing others a chance to speak, things which can all be forgotten in the excitement of a good RPG session. There is a short example of different types of players and a little prep list pointing out some things you might want to keep in mind. Most of this is fairly obvious, but certainly doesn't detract from the value of the book. And we round off the section with a useful glossary of terms before moving on to the players section of the book. Glossaries are a great inclusion in books, in my opinion, especially in RPGs that often use acronyms and game-specific terminology. It's very useful to have something to refer back to during play. The player section covers how to create a character in the Tale RPG and also discusses how your characters level up or improve over time. The chapter begins by stating that character creation in Tale is very easy compared to several other fantasy role-playing games. Whether or not this proves to be the case, it seems clear that the author is staking their claim firmly on the rules light, or narrative side if you want to call it that, of the RPG style divide. Whilst my own preference is clearly for rules light games, I do have a little bit of a problem with the assumed air of superiority that can hang around some games on both sides of the divide. As someone who strives to be fair in their reviews, I've long acknowledged that just because something doesn't fit my individual preferences, that doesn't mean it might not work for somebody else. The chapter moves on with a simple bullet point list describing the broad strokes of getting started with character creation. These are: pick a campaign set. This would appear to be either a GM-created world or a pre-designed package. Pick a diploma set. I wasn't entirely sure what a diploma set was at this point, but referring to the handy glossary, it's apparently an archetype of a character with attributes and some mechanics to serve as a basis for creating your own player character. So I suppose sort of a bit like a class or a template or something like that. Diploma. Apparently this determines the level of education that your character possesses, although I'm not sure how at this point. Unfortunately, the relevant page references were just listed as X's, but I assume this will be sorted out in the final version. General characteristics. Guided by the diploma set chosen, the player picks a single characteristic from a number of categories to define their character's appearance, religion, hair colour, that sort of stuff. This will be very familiar to anyone who's played or GM'd a Powered by the Apocalypse game, as it's the sort of stuff you tend to see in the character playbooks. Ability set. Continuing the Powered by the Apocalypse influence, the player then picks a stat package that determines their character's raw abilities. Personality. Not really sure how this works. The capsule description seems a little bit confused. Ambition. Again, the description's a bit bare bones, but it seems to relate around picking two ambitions, one that gives you a +1 to rolls if you're working with it, and the other a -1 if you're working against it, or something similar like that. So like a benefit and a flaw, I believe. You then pick gear, which is like you get some starting equipment, and you get to choose 2 other items from a list. Again, very similar to something like Dungeon World or Tremulous. You also get a series of skills related to your archetype that either grant you bonuses to rolls under certain circumstances, or additional resources when you successfully make a roll. A few examples are provided, but to my mind, they are a little confusing and unintuitive. I'm sure with judicious flipping between the text and the earlier glossary, it would be fairly straightforward. However, On a simplified breakdown, I would expect not to have to keep flipping back to a guide in order to reference various acronyms. You also get abilities, which are some modifiers from skills and gear, that sort of stuff. The section goes on to discuss a number of other aspects that make up a character, including primary traits, which apparently act as hit points, secondary traits, an adventuring table, and a character web, which is sort of like a relationship map between various characters. One thing I did find a little odd was the boxed out tip at the end of this section advising players that they are okay to lie about their character's intentions, but they might not be the only one doing so. I'm not so sure about this, to be perfectly honest. Characters lying about intentions is entirely understandable, but players? Still, I suppose it comes down to what sort of game you're looking to play. Perhaps I've been running those player party against the world D&D games for too long. Next we move on to the first of the Diploma sets provided with Tail, apparently the first of many planned for the game. The Diploma set appears to be partly a background tool, providing a reason for the party to be working together. In this case, all players were educated at the Academy of Marilyn, a sort of fantasy D&D version of Hogwarts, if you want to see it that way, and a sort of party character generation aid, providing the archetypes for the various characters to be generated with. For example, in this set we get the Lawmaster, a knowledgeable, studious sort, the Clairvoyant, a mystic scryer connected to the stars, the Channeler, who practices blood magic, the Tinkerer, someone who studies the mechanics of nature, the Prospector, travelling and searching for resources, the Smith, producing metalwork, and a fair few others ranging from anatomists to alchemists. Each of these diploma types gets a list of skills and abilities applicable to their speciality. The next section is attributes, and these are used when performing various actions in-game. No surprises there, and operate on a scale of -3, the weakest, to 0, which is average, all the way up to +3, which is mighty. The attributes in question are strength, agility, memory, wit, charisma, and fortune. Most of these will be fairly familiar to the RPGing crowd and are pretty self-explanatory. Fortune requires a bit of extra explanation though. In this game it measures a character's standing with fate and the gods. It seems to be a luck style trait, although how this figures in the later mechanics we'll have to wait and see. Primary traits are a measure of internal vigour, representing the amount of strain that your body, mind and soul can take before essentially shutting down. The diploma chosen provides details on how to calculate these traits, but essentially they're worked out using the various different attributes that your character possesses. We also get to find out what some of the acronyms from the earlier summary refer to. Each character also has resistance traits ranging from 0 to 3 that help a player resist damage from incoming attacks, acting as armour for whatever primary trait they apply to. So we have BR, which is body resistance, MR, mind resistance, and SR, which is soul resistance. We then move on to a discussion of secondary traits, and these are a measure of a character's attained wealth in different areas, whether that be money, social standing, or whatever. The game has an abstract way of representing this with points. For example, you would not calculate every coin you have on your person. Instead, you would have loot points that you can receive as a reward and that can be spent to accumulate goods. I must admit that at this point, that if these points are just spent to obtain loot, I'm not sure what advantage there is to using these points beyond simply using coins. Indeed, the game even advises, when talking about loot in-game, refer to them as gold, silver coins, etc., to escape the awkward meta-talk. In addition to loot, there is also trust. These points are spent to help, hinder other player characters. Favour, spent to gain help from a deity or religion. Law, representing esoteric knowledge. And supply. I have to confess as to being a little bit bewildered as to what supply points do. The writing seems to define them as being used for skills, but also says that supply can be found laying around during adventures. I found the writing a little bit confused when it came to this. Next we go on to ambition, which is split into need and desire. Now ambition is a short description of why you go adventuring, that being the need, and what you hope to get out of it, that being the desire. I have to admit I was surprised when the need appears to apply a negative modifier towards an ability. For example, to prove myself to the Academy of Arcana. Isolated from others, -1 charisma. Desire seems to be the reverse of this, providing a bonus to an ability. For example, rigorous studies +1 memory. I like the idea of solidifying a reason to go adventuring and a character's desire on sheet. It gives a good solid hook for roleplay and justification for why your character does what they do. Next we move on to personality, and I said earlier I was a bit confused by what exactly this meant in terms of the system. Here we get a more detailed breakdown. Put simply, the player chooses a personality archetype, analyst, explorer, sentinel, etc. And these give you modifiers, both bonuses and penalties, to your attributes. At this stage, only 4 such archetypes are offered, but the book seems to suggest that more are available. Next we have leveling up, and again, seemingly trying to distance itself from more traditional fantasy RPGs. The game offers a simple experience point system where the GM awards from 1 to 15 XP based on a chart of story-based awards. Players then spend these awards to increase certain of their stats. Seems like a simple and workable system. There are also some brief notes on raising ability maximums when the PCs reach that sort of legendary/mythical level. We then move on to the next chapter in the book, which is the player mechanics chapter, and it's where we start getting down to the real nitty-gritty of the game mechanics. The author claims that a few deciding characteristics govern a large amount of possibilities. While character customization is limited to several attributes and choices, those attributes cover every conceivable situation. It also allows the player to plunge through dice roll situations. This sounds pretty cool from my point of view. I'm a great fan of games with a strong core mechanic that can be used for a variety of different situations. Up until now, I've been getting a little concerned with the sheer amount of stats and derived stats in this game, but perhaps they're just there so the player has everything at their fingertips on their character sheet. It would depend on the elegance of the mechanics, in my opinion, as to whether this is the case. So let's just dive straight in. We get a brief explanation of the typical social flow in an RPG before moving on to what I presume are the 5 core action mechanics of the game. Action resolution seems to involve rolling a variable number of 6-sided dice and adding a modifier. This is then either compared against a resolution number determined by the GM or a specific table of results listed on the player diploma. Action results largely seem to follow the Power by the Apocalypse model, where for 6 or less it's a failure, 7 to 9 is a partial success, and 10 plus is a success. Tale adds that a roll of 2 6s is a critical success, and a roll of double 1 is a critical failure. In addition to the basic rolling mechanic, a player can choose to spend one of their mind, body or soul attribute points, dependent on the nature of the roll, for a boost, although what the actual boost isn't explicitly stated here. I assume it's a +1 since spending your last point in an attribute gives double the bonus but results in death afterwards. We then get a list of everyday actions, attack, defend, larceny, etc. that PCs might be expected to get up to in a particular game. Again, this will be familiar to anyone who has played a Power by the Apocalypse game. I don't mind this style of game, although some people bridle at the thought of it restricting creativity. I've never found that to be an issue whilst running a Power by the Apocalypse game. The actions are just a system way of handling whatever the PCs intend to do. My only slight niggle would be that the actual descriptions of the action results seem to be a little bare bones and rely on making simple adjustment to various stats, whereas most Power by the Apocalypse games I've played in the past have given a little more description for their various actions. Next we have quality, and quality actions seem to occupy a place roughly analogous to saving throws in something like D&D. As the game describes it, qualities are tested as part of an obstacle or encounter in the quest. Breaking down doors, cracking a code, resisting a poisonous gas. Difficulty is decided by the game's master beforehand. They also seem to cover anything that relies on a raw attribute such as strength for breaking down a door rather than an actual skill. Next we start getting into the mechanics of the actual skills, seemingly working in a way similar to earlier actions. The main point of these skills seems to be the accumulation and spending of the secondary traits, law, favour and supply, as we discussed a short moment ago. I found the writing in this section a little confusing, seemingly discussing spending the secondary trait pool based on skill trees that the player has chosen, but splitting skills into major skills, of which your PCs can have only one, and a basic skill that can be purchased with impunity using XP. We next get a list of gear and services that can be purchased using loot points, covering 12 plus pages and tailing into a section discussing quest items very briefly, but hinting there may be more further down the line and in the GM section. Crafting and Combat provides some systems for making your own gear and then moves straight into combat rules. Combat has an initiative system determined by rolling your wits plus agility, minus your speed, and modified by weapon speed, but only when a weapon is drawn. Combat is split into rounds, as with traditional RPGs, and proceeds until the enemy yields, is dead, or some other form of resolution is achieved. Damage has a fairly simple formula to calculate it. However, in addition to this, the person suffering from damage has to make an injury roll modified by the damage taken to see whether any additional effects take place, ranging from reduced damage to getting knocked over. Now, I've seen Powered by the Apocalypse games where injury rolls in a similar fashion are used, but generally they seem to have taken the place of a more traditional damage infliction system. Tales seems to be double dipping on the damage. Beyond adding in more dice rolls, I'm not sure what this actually adds in terms of game enjoyment. In addition to this, the player has the option of taking a trauma to mitigate some of the raw damage at the cost of having a lasting injury or effect. This reminds me of a less elegant form of Fate's consequences. I'm left with the impression that combat could be quite lengthy, certainly if the GM and players weren't intimately familiar with the system, and potentially extremely lethal, which could work and does in a lot of games. We then get a discussion of what to do if a PC dies, and a few pages on diseases and poisons. If you're not facing combat exhaustion at this point, the book moves on to provide a list of specific combat maneuvers, combat stances that can affect your various scores in combat. These cover a variety of offensive and defensive things you could do, such as charging, grappling, parrying, and withdrawing. We then move on to a section about healing, where it covers how damage can be removed using first aid kits and the like, basically coming down to someone making a heal check and restoring a certain amount of the appropriate damage at the cost of their various curative materials. The next section deals with magic and begins with a caution that magic may look complicated at first, but it is customizable and non-restrictive. And it explains there are 4 sources of magic in the game: High Arcana, Arcana, Altera, and Astra, with High Arcana being the magic granted by the gods, and the other 3 being various pillars of mysticism used by mortals. We then get an explanation of magical auras, which are residual energies left when magic has been used. Unsurprisingly, each has a number of properties: source, flavour and magnitude, determining where the magic comes from, what type it is, and how strongly it has imprinted on the surroundings. We then get a couple of examples of casting spells and rituals. Each of the examples seems to focus mainly on the meta mechanics of casting spells. Each of the examples appears to deal with an individual or group of individual NPCs, referred to as mention plus a number. I must admit to being uncertain whether this is the name of the NPC or a skill that they possess. If it is the former, I found this unnecessarily confusing in examples that should be endeavouring to make the system as transparent and easy to understand as possible, as far as I'm concerned. We get a brief description of magical items before moving on to the next section. The survival section of the book covers essentially a mini-game involving shepherding resources and providing for yourselves and your comrades during your travels. This will be familiar to anyone who has played a hex crawl or one of the earlier versions of D&D. Now, I'm a big fan of the survival mini-game, since I think if done well, it can encourage players to think about their supplies without really interfering with the main flow of the game. In Tale, you begin by calculating your comfort rating, which is an abstract number representing the gear that you're bringing along with you, your encumbrance, and other things like that. The author advises that players should have a plan to roleplay how their characters relax and unwind during downtime on the journey. The system imposes a small penalty if the players do not have such a plan, and there are also some rules for setting up a campsite and how this might affect the tiredness level of the characters. This chapter of the book rounds up with a short capsule description of the rules governing a GM, including an admonishment for the GM not to take any action without first asking the players, "What do you do?" and a description of clues, which are sort of like in-game plot points. Failure to accomplish certain goals or follow up on clues awards a GM marks, which are presumably used to carry out GM moves in the Power by the Apocalypse mode. The next chapter is called the World of Tale, and it provides a short introduction to the world full of perils, magic and mysteries where Tale is set. The world of Tale appears to be a fairly typical fantasy world, divided into a number of large continents and island chains. There is a nice black and white world map on page 106, and we get a brief description of the three main continents, which are Odin, a large unclaimed desert formerly occupied by dwarves, Eogus, a continent fought over by several sovereign territories, and Atia, the smallest continent covered by Arctic wastelands, jungle and a large volcano. The mix of jungles and Arctic terrain seems a little odd, but in a world of magic, I suppose anything is possible. We then get a slightly more detailed breakdown of the different continents, and I'm not going to cover them all in detail here, but suffice to say, most of the standard fantasy tropes are well represented here. The writing is brisk, with the whole section only taking half a dozen pages. We then get a section on religion that begins by telling us the gods are real and their power is directly related to the number of followers. It's nice to see this stated up front, and we also get the 7 spheres of influence that gods operate in, these being Arcana, Dragons, Forest, Mountain, Void, Watcher and the 3 Fires. There's a brief rundown of the spheres and what they represent, along with some bite-sized descriptions of an example god who is primarily concerned with that sphere. The chapter on cosmology purports to explain the relationship between the world and other realms. It starts with a small sketchy diagram. I'm not sure if this will be replaced with a more polished version in the final book, showing a slightly confusing world surrounded by the Astra and separated by a veil from Altera, a sort of warped shadow version of the real world where horrible creatures dwell. Altera is this game's version of Hell, Limbo, or the Shadowfell if you're of a 5th edition persuasion, whilst the Astra seems to be a mixture of outer space and Lovecraftian horror. Now, cramming a bit of madness and terror into any game is no bad thing as far as I'm concerned. The next section deals with the supernatural, and according to the book, supernatural study involves languages heavily. This is a cool idea and leans into that whole sort of magic world vibe. However, what we get is another sketchy diagram and lyrical but ultimately meaningless short descriptions of the various elements. For example, the description for Quicksilver begins, "Ever slippery and formless is the mind." This sort of thing isn't really necessary in my opinion. It doesn't really tell you a great deal despite being fairly poetic. I would have preferred a shorter but more descriptively useful text. The history section provides a brief timeline that has all the usual stuff you'd expect in a fantasy game. Kingdoms rising and falling, wars being fought between them, etc. Oddly enough, for me, the most interesting thing in the timeline is a little subsection labelled Modern Times that basically says there have been no significant events in the last 5 years. Now, I found this intriguing. If nothing has happened in the last 5 years, why did the author feel the need to specifically mention it? Is there something sinister behind the relatively recent piece? Yeah, I think you could really spin a banging story out of that. The section on campaign sets deals with these seemingly pre-made compilations of quests, errands, obstacles, locations and NPCs that the Time Push GM can just pick up and run with. Now, I love this sort of thing. Although I'm a mad prep head myself, I get that it's not always easy or desirable to find the time to spend hours detailing NPCs or notating maps. I love this sort of thing in Power by the Apocalypse games like Tremulous or Alas for the Awful Sea, where it gives you a playset so you can just pick it up and jump pretty much straight into running a game. It's great for cons and it's great for the odd beer and pretzels game session. Unfortunately, this section seems only to be an introduction to playsets, teasing you with brief descriptions of what they contain, which is somewhat unfortunate. However, the section does seem to break off abruptly, so perhaps they're planning to add these in the final version. We then move on to the Games Masters section, and this is one of my favourite in the book. not just because I'm a compulsive games master, but also because it doesn't try and present itself as some all-knowing authority on GMing. The advice is short and to the point, mostly comprising bullet point lists. The advice covers the gamut from handling common situations in RPGs to specific rules queries that might arise within the Tale game. These are all covered in the same no-nonsense fashion, providing bullet point lists containing useful hints and tips for the GM. My only quibble with this chapter is that it feels a little schizophrenic to me. On one hand, the advice is uncomplicated, useful and mercifully brief. After all, there are already hundreds upon hundreds of books containing GMing advice. On the other hand, there are large lists of traits, abilities, calculations for different levels, and other more crunchy stuff. This chapter sums up Tale as a whole for me. It has some interesting ideas, but it doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be. Some parts of the book read like it's going to be a light narrative game, whereas others feel like a more traditional D&D-esque RPG. Towards the end of the GMing chapter, the writing seems to give way to huge lists, providing GM modifiers and additional guidelines for spells and other stuff that's already dispersed in the front part of the book. Now, this is just my personal opinion, obviously, but I don't seriously think we need 30 plus pages providing modifiers for spells and rituals, in addition to what's already in the players section. If you're a game with a free-form magic system, then a smaller list of modifiers and general guidelines would have been far more palatable. If, on the other hand, you're a more traditional spellcasting system, then just provide a simple system with a list of clearly defined spells and be done with it. Again, to me, this section feels like the game wanted to have an elegant free-form magic system, but then, for some reason, decides that 2 large sections detailing modifiers for alternatives and different situations is required. This is followed by a system for building various magical items, along with a large list of powers that they can possess, and a similarly detailed system for creating potions and herbal infusions. If you love systems that allow you to build almost anything you want using a huge list of powers and points, you'll probably enjoy this and get a lot out of it. To be honest, it's not for me though. The next section is called Expanding the World of Tale, and in a similar vein to the GMing chapter, this part of the book begins with some useful GMing advice on how you can bring the world of Tale to life for the players. It provides some useful information on NPCs. Although none of it is 100% essential, I'm pretty sure we all know that a mercenary is a sword, axe or bow for hire. It's presented well and will be useful for GMs, especially newer ones, as a reference point. This is followed by a discussion of locations, realms and other game artifacts, presented in a clear format, generally a number of thought-provoking questions and tips, all very useful. Next we have the Quest Creation Kit, and this section purports to contain the in-house system that the creators use to create all of their stories for the game. Now, I'm not sure I'm 100% sold on this. Now, don't get me wrong, I think worksheets, advice, prompts are all great, and I love a random table for inspiration. But I find it difficult to imagine a single system that could encapsulate the wonder and variety of outcomes possible in RPGs. Luckily, the word system is a bit of a misnomer. What you actually get in this chapter is a very loose framework for creating the stereotypical fantasy quest. Now, what do I mean by stereotypical quest? You know the type, the one where an event occurs, someone approaches the NPCs and gives them a quest to go and sort it out, there's a conflict and some sort of twist, and then the PCs triumph. The in-house system provides a lot of advice for creating the different elements of such a quest. It goes into a bit more detail, describing how you can create a web of NPCs to challenge and resonate with the player characters. That's not to say the prompts and advice in this section are bad, far from it. However, if you've been role-playing for a while, none of it will be a surprise for you. Newer GMs may get a bit more mileage out of it though. Next is the Errand Creation Kit, and errands are small side quests, and this section pretty much mirrors the one before, providing prompts and questions to inspire you with side quest creation. In fact, it so closely mirrors the section above, I found myself asking on multiple occasions whether the 2 chapters couldn't have been combined and condensed into a single, less verbose chapter. And finally, we round things off with a nice little bestiary, although there's only really 8 pages of assorted creatures provided. So there we go, that's my review of Tale, the role-playing game. I think it's a system that does have some promise, however it really doesn't seem to have yet made up its mind what it wants to be, a slick storytelling game or a crunchy, more traditional RPG. I think if it was sorted out, some of the inconsistencies were ironed out, and maybe the text was edited a little bit more and illustrated, that would significantly bump the value of the game up, in my opinion. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you have, feel free to like, subscribe, click on the bell to get notifications, etc. Hopefully we'll see you next time on Red Death Diaries. Whatever games you're playing out there, have fun and enjoy yourself. Take care.